It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a group of 5 friends heading deep into the woods for a few days of hiking, camping, and disconnecting from the stresses of their daily lives. They were all experienced campers, and the wilderness had always been a source of adventure for them. This time, they had chosen a location far off the beaten path, a dense forest area nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. The locals called it Hollow Creek, a place few dared to venture into. But for this group, that only added to the appeal. They arrived at the trailhead on a crisp autumn morning, the air cool and fresh, and the leaves just starting to turn shades of gold and crimson. The first few hours of the hike went smoothly. The trail was rugged but manageable, and they marveled at the untouched beauty of the landscape. By late afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, they decided to start looking for a suitable campsite. That's when they stumbled upon it. At first, it seemed like a stroke of luck. An abandoned camp deep in the woods, complete with old but still functional tents, a fire pit, and a few scattered belongings. There were plates still resting on makeshift wooden tables, cups overturned in the grass, and sleeping bags laid out as if ready to be used. The scene looked as if the people who had been there had left in a hurry, but there was no sign of anyone around. No cars, no equipment, no tracks leading away from the site. It was as though the campers had simply vanished. Maybe they left for a day hike and got lost? One of the friends, Ryan, suggested as he glanced around, a hint of unease in his voice. Or maybe they had an emergency and abandoned camp, Olivia, the group's organizer, added, trying to sound logical, though she couldn't quite shake the eerie feeling creeping up her spine. Regardless, the group decided to set up their own camp a short distance away. They figured the abandoned site would make for an interesting story to tell back home, but nothing more. They built a fire, cooked dinner, and shared stories as the stars began to twinkle overhead. The strange discovery soon faded from their minds, and they laughed, enjoying the solitude of the woods. But as the night grew darker, something changed. It started as faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing. At first, they thought it was the wind moving through the trees, but the sound grew louder and more distinct. Laughter, voices, murmurs of conversation, the kind of sounds you'd expect from a group of people around a campfire, chatting and sharing jokes. Except there was no one else out there. The friends fell silent, their eyes scanning the darkness beyond their campfire's flickering light. The laughter and voices seemed to be coming from the abandoned camp. "Do you guys hear that?" asked Emily, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Ryan replied, his eyes wide as he peered into the night. "It's like someone's out there." "Maybe the campers came back?" Olivia suggested, though even she didn't believe her own words. Sam, the most skeptical of the group, shook his head. "There's no one there. We would have seen or heard them coming back." He grabbed a flashlight and stood up. "I'll go check it out." Before anyone could stop him, Sam walked toward the abandoned camp, his flashlight beam cutting through the thickening darkness. The rest of the group sat in tense silence, listening as the voices grew louder, clearer. They could now make out fragments of conversation, unintelligible, but undeniably human. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voices stopped. A few minutes later, Sam returned, his face pale. "There's no one there," he said, sitting down by the fire again. "But the voices, it's like they're right there, like we're overhearing a conversation that isn't happening." The group tried to laugh it off, but the mood had shifted. They decided to call it a night, retreating into their tents. But the eerie feeling lingered. That night, they couldn't sleep. The voices returned, louder than before, echoing through the trees like a spectral chorus. But now, it wasn't just laughter and casual conversation. There was something darker in the tone, whispers of fear, sharp cries of alarm, desperate pleas. It was as if the night was replaying some terrible moment from the past. Ryan crawled out of his tent, his heart pounding. "Did you guys hear that?" he called to the others. One by one, they emerged from their tents, their faces pale and drawn. "I heard someone scream," Emily said, her voice trembling. "It sounded like someone was in pain." "I think we need to leave," Olivia said firmly. "This place, it's not right." Just as they began packing up, the wind picked up, swirling through the camp with a sudden force that extinguished their fire. The darkness seemed to close in around them, and in the distance, the echo of footsteps crunching on the forest floor grew nearer. Panic set in as the group hurried to pack their things, but it felt as though the forest itself was working against them. Branches snapped nearby, and shadows moved in the corner of their vision. The whispers were now all around them, circling like a predator stalking its prey. "Come on!" Sam yelled as he grabbed his backpack. "We have to go now!" They stumbled through the darkness, their flashlights flickering as they made their way back to the trail. But the deeper they went into the woods, the more disoriented they became. The once familiar path twisted and turned, leading them further into the forest rather than out. And then they saw it. Standing in the middle of the trail, illuminated by the moonlight, was a figure. A tall, shadowy figure, dressed in tattered camping gear. His face was obscured, but the outline was unmistakable. He was one of the missing campers. But he wasn't alive. The figure stood motionless, and as the group froze in place, more figures emerged from the trees. Men, women, all dressed as if they'd been part of the camp. Lost souls, trapped in the woods, bound to the camp that had claimed them. "You shouldn't have come here," one of the figures whispered, their voice hollow and distant. The group broke into a sprint, hearts racing as they fled through the woods, the spectral figures silently watching from the shadows. The whispers followed them, growing fainter as they ran. After what felt like hours, they finally burst out of the forest and onto the main road. Gasping for breath, they looked back one last time. The figures were gone. The forest was silent, as if nothing had ever happened. They never spoke of the experience again, but every now and then, late at night, one of them would wake up to the faint sound of laughter and whispers, as if the echoes of the lost camp still lingered in the deep woods, waiting for their next victims. It was supposed to be a routine weekend trip, just a group of 5 friends heading out to one of the more remote sections of the national park. They were seasoned hikers and nature enthusiasts, always eager to discover new trails and explore uncharted parts of the wilderness. But this time, they had chosen a section of forest that few dared to enter, a place that had been mostly untouched by humans for decades. The locals had their reasons for avoiding it, but to these adventurers, the unexplored territory was exactly what they were looking for. The drive to the forest took longer than expected. Dirt roads turned into little more than narrow, overgrown paths, barely wide enough for the jeep. As they drove deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, blocking much of the fading daylight. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Lisa asked from the back seat, her voice tinged with doubt. "Yeah, the map says it's just another mile ahead," Mark replied, steering the jeep with confidence. "We'll be the first ones to set foot here in years. Imagine what kind of wildlife we'll find." "I don't know," Sarah said, glancing out the window. "The locals seemed pretty serious when they warned us not to come here. They said people have gone missing in these woods." "Superstition," Mark shrugged. "Every small town has stories like that. Keeps tourists out, that's all." They parked the jeep in a small clearing, the sky already turning a deep shade of purple as evening settled in. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the forest around them seemed to hum with the sounds of nature. Birds called to each other from high in the trees, and the rustle of leaves hinted at small creatures scurrying through the underbrush. They set up camp quickly, 2 tents, a campfire, and a simple dinner to start the night. As darkness fully enveloped the forest, the group settled in around the fire, the light flickering off their faces, casting shadows that seemed to dance and shift in the trees. "So, what's the deal with this place anyway?" Jason asked, tossing another log onto the fire. "Why is everyone so freaked out about it?" Lisa leaned in closer, her voice lowering conspiratorially. "It's called Blackwood Forest. According to local legend, there's something out here, something that guards the woods. They say that people who come too far into its territory disappear, leaving no trace behind except signs of a struggle. No one's ever been able to explain it. "Guardians of the forest," Mark scoffed. "Sounds like a bad horror movie plot." "It's probably just wild animals," Sarah added, though her voice lacked conviction. "Bears, wolves, something big enough to scare people off." "Yeah, but I've heard these disappearances don't look like animal attacks," Lisa said. "People have found tents shredded, gear scattered around, but no bodies, just gone." The conversation trailed off as the fire crackled, the sounds of the forest growing louder in the silence. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them admitted it out loud. They all felt it, a sense that the woods were watching them, waiting. Eventually, they decided to turn in for the night. The forest was eerily quiet as they zipped up their tents, the fire slowly dying down to embers. But sleep didn't come easily. Sometime in the middle of the night, Sarah was jolted awake by a sound, faint at first, but growing louder. It was the unmistakable crunch of footsteps moving through the brush just outside her tent. She lay still, her heart pounding in her chest, straining to listen. The steps were slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was circling their camp. "Mark?" she whispered, hoping it was just him getting up to check on something. No response. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and she held her breath. Then, just as suddenly as they had stopped, they resumed, this time faster, like someone was running through the trees. It was followed by a low, guttural growl, a sound so deep and primal it made her blood run cold. She unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The fire had long since gone out, and the clearing was bathed in darkness. But just beyond the tree line, she could see something moving, large and fast, too quick to make out any details. She pulled the zipper closed again and curled into her sleeping bag, heart racing. Morning came too slowly. When the first rays of light filtered through the trees, Sarah was already awake, her eyes wide with fear. She wasn't the only one. "I heard something last night," Lisa said as they gathered around the remnants of the campfire, her voice trembling slightly. "Something big. It was moving through the trees." "So did I," Sarah whispered. "I thought it was just a dream, but..." They looked at each other, the tension between them palpable. "Maybe it was a bear," Mark suggested, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Let's just pack up and get out of here." They began to dismantle the camp, moving quickly as the unease from the night before lingered in the air. But as Jason went to retrieve his backpack from the edge of the clearing, he froze. "Guys?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Come look at this." The others hurried over, and what they saw sent a chill down their spines. In the soft earth near the tree line were massive footprints, larger than any humans, and too round to be a bear's. The prints led from the forest to the very edge of their camp, and then disappeared back into the trees. That wasn't here last night," Sarah stammered. "Let's go," Lisa urged. "Now." They grabbed their gear and started the hike back toward the jeep, their eyes darting nervously between the trees. The forest seemed darker, more oppressive than it had the day before. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made them jump. As they hurried down the trail, they began to notice more strange signs. Scratches on trees, deep gouges in the bark that looked like claw marks, piles of rocks arranged in strange, deliberate patterns along the path. And always, just on the edge of hearing, that low growl following them through the woods. "Faster," Mark urged, his voice tight with fear. "We need to get out of here now." The group broke into a run, the trail twisting and turning as the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees loomed taller, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the light. And then, up ahead, they saw it. The jeep, parked just where they'd left it. Relief washed over them as they sprinted the last few yards to the vehicle. But just as they reached it, a deafening roar echoed through the forest, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. They piled into the jeep, slamming the doors shut, and Mark gunned the engine. The tires spun in the dirt for a moment before catching traction, and they sped down the narrow road, the roar still echoing behind them. No one spoke as they drove back to town. The forest grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the memory of what they had encountered stayed with them. Later, they learned the truth about Blackwood Forest. The locals called it the domain of the forest guardian, a powerful being that protected the land from intruders. It was said that those who ventured too far into its territory were never seen again. They had been lucky, this time. But as they left the forest behind, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had been watched, judged, and spared. The forest guardian had let them go, but it wouldn't be so merciful to the next group that dared to enter its domain. I've always loved camping. The peacefulness of the forest, the fresh air, and the chance to disconnect from the hustle and bustle of everyday life always drew me in. I've been hiking and camping in many of the national parks around the U.S. But what happened to me last year in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest still gives me nightmares. This wasn't just a creepy camping trip. It was something far more terrifying. It all started when I decided to take a solo trip to the Olympic National Forest in Washington. I'd been there before with friends, but this time, I wanted to experience it alone. The plan was simple: hike deep into the woods, find a secluded spot, and camp out for a few nights. The forest is known for its beauty and isolation, and I was looking forward to being completely off the grid. I arrived at the trailhead in the early morning, packed up my gear, and began the hike. The deeper I went, the quieter the world around me became. It felt like I was the only person in the entire forest. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a stream nearby for water. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the night. As the sun began to set, the forest came alive with the sounds of wildlife. I've camped enough to be familiar with the typical noises: rustling leaves, the occasional call of a distant owl, but something about this place felt different. There was an unusual stillness that settled over the woods as darkness fell. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off as nerves, but then, just as I was getting ready to turn in for the night, I heard it. Heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My heart rate spiked as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard it again, closer this time. It wasn't the sound of a deer or any animal I'd ever heard before. These were deliberate, heavy steps, like something or someone was walking on two legs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No response. I stood frozen, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. That's when I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, low to the ground, staring back at me from the shadows. They were too big to belong to any normal animal, and they didn't blink or move. Just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished, and the footsteps resumed, this time moving away from my camp. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the fire, clutching my knife and flashlight, listening for any more signs of movement. But nothing else happened. By the time dawn broke, I convinced myself it must have been some kind of animal, maybe a bear. I decided to stay another night, thinking the daylight would calm my nerves. The next day, I spent most of my time exploring the area, gathering wood, and trying to shake off the lingering fear from the previous night. But as the sun began to set again, the uneasy feeling returned. This time, it was stronger. As darkness fell, I once again heard the footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at the edge of the camp. They circled me. Every time I turned toward the sound, it would stop, only to pick up again from another direction. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew something was out there, and it was toying with me. I quickly stoked the fire, hoping the light would keep whatever it was at bay. That's when I heard a low growl, deep, guttural, and far too close for comfort. My blood turned to ice as I scanned the trees again. That's when I saw it. A massive figure, far larger than any bear, stepped out from the shadows. It was covered in thick, matted fur, standing upright like a man, but hunched over. Its eyes glowed red in the firelight, and its long, sharp teeth were bared in a snarl. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. a creature straight out of myth and legend, a werewolf. I bolted for my tent, grabbing my rifle as I stumbled inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely load the weapon, but I managed to do it just as the creature let out another growl. I could hear its heavy breathing as it moved closer, circling my camp. For what felt like hours, the creature stalked me, moving just beyond the light of the fire. Every now and then, I'd hear a branch snap or a low snarl, but it never fully showed itself again. I stayed huddled in my tent, rifle in hand, praying for the sun to rise. When dawn finally broke, the forest was eerily quiet. There was no sign of the creature, but I didn't stick around to find out if it would come back. I packed up my gear in record time and hiked out of there, never looking back. As I reached the trailhead and got into my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been incredibly lucky to survive the night. I did some research afterward, and while there are plenty of stories and legends about werewolves in the Pacific Northwest, I never thought I'd encounter one myself. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since, and I don't plan on going alone ever again.